Protests on the streets of Venezuela turning deadly after President Nicolas Maduro declares victory.
The violence on Sunday, very real. The bomb went off near some motorcycle police, wounding several.
Election day clashes between protesters and police claiming at least 10 more lives.
La elección de la Asamblea Nacional Constituyente es un fraude abierto, el mundo lo ve, lo ha visto, está claro, todos están claros de lo que sucedió.
Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro and Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi meet in Tehran and agree on a 20-year cooperation deal.
High hopes in the Mexican capital as delegates from the Venezuelan government and opposition meet at the negotiating table for the first time in more than a year. In response, the United States also announced that part of the agreement will include limited-term licenses for Chevron to resume oil extraction operations in Venezuela, a move that's seen as strategically important for the West as tightening sanctions on Russia have caused uncertainty over international oil prices.
Beyond resolving Venezuela's protracted crisis, but inseparably bound up with it, lies a question of how relations between the US and Venezuela could evolve as a result of the tectonic shift in geopolitics brought on by Russia's war in Ukraine. It is too early to draw firm conclusions, but some aspects of future US engagement in the region are already beginning to surface. Long before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many in the US foreign policy establishment considered that neither Moscow nor Beijing had any business planting flags in the Western Hemisphere. Many advisors and analysts believe that it would be neither practical nor appropriate for the US to attempt to revive a Cold War-style sphere of influence approach to relations with neighbours to the south. Indeed, it would run directly counter to the argument that Ukraine should be free to align itself however it chooses. Under former President Donald Trump, the United States pushed hard for regime changes within Venezuela. In response to a crackdown on democracy by Venezuela's authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro, Washington in 2019 placed sanctions on the country's vital oil sector. Along with more than 50 countries, the US recognised opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's rightful president and encouraged the Venezuelan military to topple Maduro. But none of this has worked. The military continues to back Maduro, who has kept Venezuela's crippled economy barely afloat by selling oil to China, Russia, Iran and other allies. Support for Guaido, who wields no real power, is waning, with more countries re-engaging with Maduro. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ban on Russian oil imports is prompting the US to seek new sources of energy. For those reasons, and several others we'll discuss in this video, discussions and agreements have been re-established between the US and Venezuela. But is it just the oil that makes Venezuela so strategically important? Or is there more to the story? We have a lot to unpack here. We aim to keep our videos short and concise. The challenge is 10 minutes. Let's begin. Economic deterioration in Venezuela has driven the largest external displacement in Latin America's recent history. The United Nations claim that 6.8 million people have left, more than have fled any other country except Syria and Ukraine. Here's what you need to know about what is happening in Venezuela. The humanitarian crisis in Venezuela was triggered by the economic collapse that began in 2014 and has been deepening ever since. A quarter of the population is in need of aid. The lack of mass conflict in Venezuela makes it distinct from most of the countries on watch list, a testament to the severity of the economic meltdown, preventing millions of Venezuelans from meeting their most basic needs. The country's health system has collapsed, and hyperinflation, paired with shortages of essential resources such as water, fuel, food, and medicine, continue, causing social unrest. A third of the population, 9.3 million people, were acutely food insecure as of 2019. And while data in Venezuela is often limited or missing entirely, this figure is likely growing. 14% of all children under age 5 in Venezuela suffer from global acute malnutrition. 50% of pregnant women are malnourished. The COVID pandemic significantly exacerbated the problem. Earlier in the pandemic, border closures by Colombia and other nearby countries to prevent the spread of the coronavirus cut off many Venezuelans from access to aid or work opportunities. In 2021, ACAPS, an independent information provider for humanitarians, assessed Venezuela to have very high access constraints, but there are some signs of progress, including a new agreement to allow the World Food Programme to start delivering food aid inside the country and a new registration process for aid groups. Both steps could enable the humanitarian response to significantly scale up if humanitarians can operate without undue restrictions. Clashes between Venezuelan forces and armed groups from Colombia, as well as between armed non-state groups over contested territory within Venezuela, increased in 2021. The violence has displaced thousands from border areas in Venezuela into Colombia and could escalate further given rising tensions between the Caracas and Bogota. Many of the 6 million Venezuelans who have left have travelled to neighbouring countries such as Colombia, Ecuador and Peru, while others have headed north in hopes of asylum in the United States or Mexico. In a welcome move, the Biden administration provided a new humanitarian parole program for Venezuelans. The program, similar to the one offered to the Ukrainians, will be available for certain Venezuelans who have a private sponsor in the US. The two main drivers that will influence the outcome of the crisis are the degree of the regime's internal instability and the degree and types of external pressure or assistance the regimes receive from key international actors. One thing is certain, and that is Venezuela's crisis has ceased to be a domestic problem, giving way to a regional concern with global implications.
Todos estos meses, todo el tiempo de marcha por mi familia, por la comida, por el pueblo.
Siempre voy a estar en las calles luchando por la libertad de mis hijos. Y bueno.
La violencia del gobierno y la violencia del AMPA. Todo eso son razones para tú salir a protestar, a manifestar, a defender tus derechos y aspirar a una mejor Venezuela.
Before we deep dive Venezuela's oil and its strategic value to the US, we must quickly discuss OPEC and OPEC+. OPEC stands for the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Currently, the organisation has a total of 13 member countries, some of which include Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Additionally, there are other countries that make up OPEC+, some of which include Russia, Oman and Sudan. In accordance with its statute, the mission of OPEC is to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of its member countries and ensure the stabilisation of oil markets in order to secure efficient, economic and regular supply of petroleum to consumers. Equally prioritised is the steady income to producers and a fair return on capital for those investing in the petroleum industry. According to the current estimates, 80% of the world's proven oil reserves are located in OPEC countries. In 2021, OPEC generated approximately 40% of the world's oil production, so why should OPEC matter? Well, in 2022, OPEC and OPEC Plus agreed to slash output by 2 million barrels per day, just ahead of the peak winter season. The group stated that decision was based on the uncertainty that surrounds the global economy. So how does this affect America? The White House has framed OPEC's decision as an act of support for Russia, which relies significantly on oil and gas revenues. But Saudi Arabia has legitimate, self-interested economic reasons for pushing these cuts. The expectation of a global economic slowdown means reduced demand for oil. Saudi Arabia is looking at economic indicators that point towards a global recession within the next 6 to 9 months, which could lead to an oil crash. In 2008, the global financial crisis caused oil prices to plunge from $100 per barrel in September to $40 per barrel in December. Despite these justifiable economic reasons for cutting oil production, American policymakers are understandably dismayed by Saudi Arabia's decision. It will hurt American consumers. So what has the US done to mitigate the shortages of crude oil? Well, number one, the US will continue to release more oil from its strategic reserves. Secondly, it will look to pass the controversial NOPEC bill, opening OPEC nations to lawsuits. And lastly, they will look to ease restrictions and sanctions on Venezuela's oil. So based off this preamble, the US is looking to resupply the oil reserves it has been pulling from and reduce the high costs experienced by US citizens. And because of these cases, largely exacerbated by the Ukraine invasion and the sanctions placed on Russia since mid-2022, the US has been looking to identify other oil producers, and this is where Venezuela comes into play. As already highlighted, in 2019, President Trump imposed new financial sanctions against Venezuela. This is a response to the US's view that Maduro was seeking to attain more presidential powers. However, through necessity and desperate measure, the Biden administration has now reversed these sanctions in order to allow Chevron Corp to resume pumping oil, paving the way for a potential reopening of US and European markets to oil exports from Venezuela. In exchange for the significant sanction relief, President Maduro vowed to resume long-suspended talks with the country's opposition to discuss conditions needed to hold free and fair presidential elections in 2024. The US and Venezuela government have also worked out a deal that would free up hundreds of millions of dollars in Venezuelan state funds frozen in American banks to pay for the import of food, medicine and equipment for the country's battered electricity grid and state water system. As of January 2023, Venezuela embarks a third oil cargo ship to Chevron under the newly signed US license. The third cargo represents a solid start to an agreement expected to last at least 6 months. The Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector prioritises US geostrategic interests. So what should we look out for? The US-Venezuela deal is meant to show Maduro that sanction relief is possible when it makes concrete agreements that are then monitored and upheld. But the license is only for 6 months and is limited in scope. Sanctions can be snapped back at any point. This shows Maduro that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but that light can quickly be extinguished if he does not act in good faith. The Maduro regime would not be in power today if it were not for the support it receives from its 5 key allies: Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, and Turkey. These states provide varying degrees of financial, diplomatic, military, and intelligence support to the Venezuelan regime. Some of these states have maintained close ties with Venezuela since the early years of the Chavez presidency. Others have emerged as new lifelines amid mounting international pressure. China, Russia, Cuba, Iran, and Turkey each have distinct financial and geopolitical motivations for propping up the Maduro regime and thus merit specific and nuanced policy approaches. China is owed by Venezuela at least $20 billion in loans established before 2017. It continues to be a strong, albeit quiet supporter of the Maduro regime and has significantly reduced its commercial ventures into Venezuela in recent years. Iran and Venezuela have a symbolic and heavily rhetorical partnership since the early years of the Chavez administration. In recent months, they have rekindled their partnership, finding common ground as two states that are deeply isolated on the world stage. In the past, Iran has demonstrated an interest in providing short-range missiles to its ideological partners, as well as armed drones and kits that can be used to improve existing rocket systems. There is a possibility that Venezuela's interest in purchasing missiles, as was recently reported by Colombian intelligence, but the status of this effort is uncertain. It is also unclear whether Iran is ready to provide these missiles or how Venezuela would pay for them. Cuba is existentially dependent on Venezuela, but also continues to have tremendous sway over the Maduro regime's intelligence apparatus, the military, and the regime's ideological rhetoric. The ideological linkage between the two countries run deep and emerged at the beginning of the Chavez administration. Turkey is a relatively new partner for the regime and has emerged as a facilitator of Venezuela's illicit gold trade. This partnership is the most unusual of the 5, given that Turkey maintains constructive diplomatic relations with the United States. Russia and Venezuela have a long-standing financial, political, military, and diplomatic partnership, with little regard for commercial risk. Russia continues to act as a lender of last resort, help Venezuela circumvent oil sanctions, fuel disinformation campaigns, and provide military supplies and equipment to the Maduro regime. There appears to be no intuitive reason for Russia to have an economic or security interest in Venezuela. The countries are 7,000 miles apart and share little historical or cultural affinities. Venezuela's main assets are oil and gas, of which Russia has plenty, and yet Russia has established itself as one of the most important partners of the Maduro regime. Russia and Venezuela's strategic partnership emerged in the early years of the Chavez presidency, as Putin sought to counter US interests in the region and re-establish Russia's prominence on the world stage. Though Russia had historic ties to the Castro regime in Cuba, Venezuela quickly emerged as an obvious partner for this endeavour. Throughout the years, Venezuela and Russia have maintained a strong military partnership. Over the years, Russia has sold Venezuela billions in military equipment, including tanks, fighter jets, small arms, and missile systems. It is important to underscore that Venezuela's current state of collapse is commercially suboptimal for many of these allies. Cuba, for example, has experienced sporadic fuel and cooking gas shortages because of the crisis in Venezuela. Russia, which has been a partner to Venezuela for years, has set to break even on most of its energy investments. China is still owed billions of dollars, and yet these states continue to support the Maduro regime and its criminal enterprises, often to push back against US interests in the region. The United States and allies should continue pressuring the regime's Fabulous 5. which should continue to help the Maduro regime evade sanctions, violate human rights, and profit from illicit activities. These alliances have distinct cultural, historical, and geopolitical nuances that should be more deeply explored. A better understanding of how these countries support the Maduro regime and how far they are willing to go may yield unexplored avenues for the interim government and its allies to find a peaceful, democratic solution. In summary, Maduro lacks support from the vast majority of the people and the international community. Maduro's last line of defence, the military, might also be getting cold feet on whether to continue to support a regime that is pushing the country to the brink of collapse. The international community still has the opportunity to pressure Maduro and help Venezuela find a path toward freedom and rule of law, but that window of opportunity is closing. As discussed, due to the decreased domestic oil production, Venezuela remains a country with the resources and proximity to be a strategic partner with the United States and a privileged destination for crude oil trade. The Fabulous Five's increasing presence in Venezuela should worry the United States. Venezuela has the natural resources, both in oil and uranium, and the willingness to engage in arms trade and nuclear cooperation with countries that do not align with the United States' interests. In 2010, former Venezuelan President Chavez signed agreements with Russia to start developing a nuclear reactor. The Nuclear Threat Initiative states that, although there is no available evidence that shows that the current government is interested in acquiring weapons of mass destruction, there are some proliferation concerns. China not only has a $60 billion in loan and investments in Venezuela, but also sees Venezuela as a strategic location. The two main drivers that will influence the outcome of the crisis are the degree of the regime's internal instability and the degree and types of external pressure or assistance the regime receives from key international actors, which naturally raises the question of how the United States would respond to a weaponized Venezuela, largely funded and armed by the Fabulous Five, or rather, what US administration could dare refrain from acting forcefully against such a threat. A thank you for sticking around to the end. This one just breached the 10-minute mark, however there was a lot to cover here and I could quite easily generate a 10-minute video on each one of these chapters. I did my best to compress the video and I'll continue to refine my craft as I release more content. If you enjoyed the video, perhaps think about hitting that subscribe button. I would also love to hear from you in the comments section. What are your thoughts on Venezuela? Are you concerned by the Fabulous Five and their vision operating so close to US soil? My next video is already in edit, so like always, stay safe and stay informed. This is Zero Fox, out.